All right, folks, this is the final video of the class. We're still talking about elections, and when I left off, I was introducing the subject of voter ID, and I made the point that in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's Shelby versus Holder decision in 2013, which struck down the pre-clearance section of the Voting Rights Act, that jurisdictions with a long history of discriminatory voting practices targeting primarily minority voters, African American voters in particular, a long history of doing so, they no longer had to submit changes to their voting requirements for federal approval. They were free in the aftermath of the Shelby versus Holder decision to go ahead and make those changes, and they did. In the immediate aftermath, literally within a day, Texas implemented a voter ID law that never would have been allowed under the pre-clearance section, and other states followed suit. And voter ID has been one of the most significant developments in election law and election procedures that we've seen in the country. So I want to get into it. It's one of those topics that, as I talk to people about it, what I find is that it just seems so reasonable to ask for ID, and what could possibly be wrong with that. And it's hard to get people to understand that what's really going on here. And in part because many of the arguments seem so reasonable, and also you can make opponents of voter ID look pretty stupid. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second.
I'm Ami Horowitz, and I'm here in Berkeley, California to find out if voter ID laws suppress the black vote. Do you have an opinion on voter ID laws?
Yeah, they're usually pretty racist and they're bad.
I think voter ID laws are a way to perpetuate racism.
Would you go as far as say those laws are racist?
For sure.
Do you think it suppresses the African American vote?
Definitely.
Tell us how.
Because they're less likely to have state IDs.
Minority voters are less likely to have the kinds of IDs that have been described or required.
These type of people don't live in areas with easy access to DMVs or other places where they can get identification.
You can always get IDs you do over the internet. Does that also make it difficult for black people in particular?
Yeah, you have to have access to the internet. You have to be able to pay an internet service provider for certain fees.
Do you think that's harder for black people to go online?
Well, I feel like they don't have the knowledge of how it works.
A lot of people have smartphones, but you might not have data.
For most of the communities, they don't really know what is out there just because they're not aware or they're not informed.
I also think there's a repression of black voting with how if you're a convicted felon, you're not allowed to vote and everything. And when you look at swing states like Florida, that's a huge population of the African Americans.
Now I'm here in East Harlem to ask black people their thoughts on what you just heard. Do you have ID normally? You carry ID around?
Yes, I have state ID.
Do you carry ID?
Yes, I do.
Do you know any black person who doesn't carry ID?
No. Everyone that I know has an ID. Why would they think we don't have ID?
That's a lie. Why would they say that?
Do you have ID?
Yes.
Because I have my ID and my friends have their ID, so we know what we need to carry around.
Everybody that I know have ID. That's one of the things you need to walk around with New York with, ID.
Do you know any black adult who does not have ID?
No, I don't.
Is it a weird thing to even say that?
Yes, it is.
What is this, some type of trick candy cameras?
I know, right?
That's the only thing I brought with me.
Those are legit IDs. I heard a lot also that black people can't figure out how to get to the DMV.
Really?
What does that say to you?
I know it's that, on 25th Street.
Do you know where the DMV is around you?
It's on 125th Street and 3rd Avenue, I believe.
You know how to get there?
Yeah.
Would you have a problem getting there if you had to get there?
No.
I know these sound like silly questions. You know how to get to the DMV?
Of course.
You know where it is?
Yes.
You can get there?
Uh-huh.
No problem.
No problem.
Just checking.
Okay.
And I also heard a lot that black people, especially poor black people, have no access to the internet, can't figure out how to use the internet.
That's just stupidity, honestly. Everybody has access to the internet. Even a little kid can figure out how to work the internet.
I had access to the internet for years.
You know how to use it properly, right?
Exactly. I do it at work. So, of course, I know how to use it. My kids know how to use it. They all have iPads, iPods, whatever.
Your phone has data? Mm-hmm. You can actually
unlimited.
Unlimited data.
Mm-hmm. I use my phone as a hotspot.
What does that say to you for the people who have this perception of black people?
They're pretty much ignorant. That's what my thought process was.
I just think that's ignorant.
Ignorant.
Ignorant. That's the word
Very,
I hear
very
a lot.
ignorant.
Ignorant.
very, very ignorant.
Does it sound racist for somebody to say that?
I think it is a little racist because, you're putting people in a category and you have no idea what you're talking about.
Maybe a little bit of racist in it, but like I said, I think it's more stupidity and ignorance.
Judging somebody, like, but you're judging them because they black, saying that they don't got it.
What people are they talking to? Who are these people talking to?
Do you have a problem that if you go to vote and they say, "Can we please see your ID to make sure you are who you say you are"?
I love showing my ID.
You got no problem with that?
Nope.
Would you have a problem if when you go to vote, if they say, "Can we please just see your ID to make sure you are who you say you are"? Do you have an issue with that?
No.
Would you have a problem if there was a rule where you had to show your ID in order to vote?
I don't think so. No.
Would you have an issue if there was a rule saying you got to show your ID before you vote? You cool with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so, here I was thinking and about to argue that voter IDs are intentionally targeting the black population primarily, not exclusively, but primarily, trying to suppress the black vote, and they themselves are racist. But it turns out that that attitude is racist. It turns out that you just saw several black people who have no problem with voter ID laws, and they have IDs, and it's racist to assume that black people don't have IDs and can't find the DMV and don't know how to use the internet. Well, of course it would be racist to assume that. But that's not the claim that was made. That's not the argument against voter ID laws. What you just saw there is a very clever rhetorical technique called the straw person argument, where you set up an argument, a claim that you attribute to the other side, and you proceed to demolish it, and you walk away saying, "My work here is done." It's clever, but it's intellectually dishonest, because no one ever said that black people don't have IDs, or that black people can't find the DMV, or that young people or old people, lower income people fall in those categories, which is exactly the groups that are targeted by voter ID laws. The claim is more sophisticated than that. The claim is there is a certain segment of the population that will not have the required IDs necessary to vote. Of that subset of the population, is that subset of the population equally distributed across race and age and income and gender, etc.? No, it's not. You will predominantly find people of color, minorities, younger people and older people there. People of color, minorities, younger people, older people, those folks tend to vote Democratic. Any voting requirement that is going to fall more heavily upon them, put an extra burden upon them, is going to shave a couple percentage points of the vote off of those loyally Democratic constituencies, and that's the point. Let me show you some data. This is from a 2012 American National Election Studies survey done by the University of Michigan. And this is looking at the percentage of the population that has confirmed ID and doesn't have confirmed ID, the types of ID that are required in voter ID legislation, by ethnicity. And you'll see that among white people, 95% of white people, according to this survey, have the necessary ID. 5% don't. Again, it's a small subset of the population that doesn't have the ID. I have it, you probably have it, but that I have it and you have it, that the 5 people that guy interviewed on the street had it, that's not the same as saying everybody has it. Of course, everybody doesn't have it. The question is, what's the composition of the population that doesn't have it, that small group? Among black people, according to this survey, 87% have the necessary ID, so the vast majority, but 13% don't. Nearly 3 times as many as among white people. Among Hispanics, it's 90 and 10%, for example. Among other racial and ethnic groups, it's 89 and 11. This is the population that is targeted in the voter ID laws, because these folks here, they're pretty loyal Democratic voters. Let's look at other characteristics. The same survey, the same basic display of the data. If you look at the higher socioeconomic status areas, $85,000 and above in household income, $100,000 above, $125,000, over $150,000, nearly everyone has the necessary ID, 95%, 96%, 96%, 98%, etc. When you get down to the lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, though, then you see much higher numbers of people without the ID. Below $25,000 in household income, 12% lack the necessary ID, 10% in the $30,000 to $35,000 range. Again, it's these folks that are the primary targets of voter ID legislation. How do low-income people tend to vote in elections? They tend to support Democrats. If you look at it in terms of age group, you'll see the same thing. Younger people are less likely to have the required ID than older people are. How do younger people tend to vote in elections? They vote for Democrats. And again, no one is saying young people don't have ID or can't get ID. What the claim is that, and is supported by the evidence, is that the population of people, the subset of people who don't have the IDs required by voter ID laws, they tend to be younger. They tend to be minorities. They're more likely to be that than to be wealthy white people. Why in the world would minorities not have the necessary IDs? Are they somehow incapable of getting it? No. The reality is that they're less likely to need it, and you're less likely to get something if you don't need it. Hispanics and blacks and other minorities are less likely to have a driver's license because they're less likely to need to drive. Why would that be? Because they're more likely to live in places with good public transportation. In cities, minorities, the population composition of cities is more heavily minority than in suburbs and in rural areas. In areas that have good public transportation, you're less likely to have a car. If you don't have a car, what do you need a license for? Again, the video that I portrayed, that I showed you, is making a straw person argument. It's distorting the claim. So to summarize, so I showed you data from the National Election Study, and this is a memo summarizing that. The rates of identification ownership are highest among whites, while other ethnic groups disproportionately lack the necessary photo ID. 13% of blacks, 10% of Hispanics, but only 5% of whites lack the ID. If you impose a requirement that you have to show this ID in order to vote, that requirement is going to disenfranchise blacks and Hispanics at a much higher rate than whites. That's what the data says. And the same goes for lower income people and for young adults. Again, I'll repeat myself, Hispanics, blacks, lower income people, and young adults, when they vote in elections, they are pretty reliable Democratic votes. The whole point of voter ID law is to not disenfranchise the entire black voting population, the entire Hispanic voting population, all low income people, all young people. No. The point is to shave a couple percentage points off that side of the electorate. Because in a highly polarized political era in which we are, where national elections are almost 50-50 propositions, a couple percentage points can mean the difference between winning and losing. That's the point. The problem that voter ID laws are supposed to combat is the voter fraud problem. The problem with that is there is no voter fraud problem. Study after study looking into claims of voter fraud over more than a decade at federal and state and local voting levels have found repeatedly that claims of voter fraud are vastly overblown, and that way more often than not, alleged instances of fraud turn out to be clerical errors, people voting who share the same name as someone else. A good friend of mine voted in the 2022 midterm election. He voted by mail, and his ballot was rejected and returned to him because the signature didn't match the name that they had on file. The problem was he and his father had the same exact name, and the signature they were looking at and verifying his signature was his father's signature. That's the kind of thing that can go wrong that triggers claims of voter fraud, but it's not voter fraud. So you see on the screen before you, and I'm not going to go over every single one of these, a number of studies and investigations that have looked into the supposed widespread voter fraud problem. The conspiracy theory claim that the 2016 and 2020 elections were rife with voter fraud, and that 2020 was stolen from Donald Trump because of fraudulent rigged elections. Study after study has found no evidence supporting anything like that. And the list goes on and on and on. One of the most interesting ones is, and this is the last one I'll show you of these studies. This last one mentioned here, a comprehensive 2014 study published in the Washington Post. This investigator looked at data from about 15 years of elections, 2002 and 2014 inclusive. And so this was elections at the federal, the state, and the local level. And so all told, that amounted to about 1 billion ballots being cast over that 15-year period at all those 3 election levels. This person was able to find 31 credible instances of voter impersonation fraud. 31. And even that number is likely inflated, as is pointed out here, because The studies, that counts not just prosecutions and convictions for voter fraud, but any and all credible claims. Voter fraud is statistically non-existent. You're more likely to have someone struck by lightning on the way to vote than have that person be on the way to commit voter fraud. And it's interesting, the people who make the claim of voter fraud and advance that claim in the service of trying to overturn, in particular, the 2020 election, even they will acknowledge that there is no fraud, that the claims they're making are not valid when asked in the right context. And what I'm referring to here is a claim. This is an article that looks at the time that Rudy Giuliani, President Trump's former personal attorney, represented Trump in a Pennsylvania election case, in one of the election challenges the Trump campaign brought against the 2020 election result, in which Giuliani represented Trump. And a couple days before, in the same state of Pennsylvania, Giuliani held a press conference alleging fraud and making all these claims about a gross miscarriage of justice because of fraudulent ballots. It's a fraud, an absolute fraud. But yet, when confronted by a judge in making that same claim and asking if he's alleging fraud, in the courtroom, Giuliani said, no, this is not a fraud case. And if you want to check it out, you can look at the YouTube video. I'm not going to take the time to go over and watch it. But you can hear Giuliani in the audio recording of his conversation with the judge saying, oh, this is not a fraud case. Why would he change his tune? Well, it's one thing to make claims about a miscarriage of justice and absolute voter fraud to the press. It's another thing to be an officer of the court, to be an attorney in a courtroom and telling a judge under oath that that's the case. There are severe penalties, including the loss of your law license and possible legal ramifications beyond that for an attorney to knowingly lie in court. So when asked in court, Giuliani backtracked completely off of the allegation of fraud. He said, this is not a fraud case. The very same case he was outside in front of this landscape business claiming to have been fraud. There's a reason that voter impersonation fraud is so rare. And by the way, I'm referring to voter impersonation fraud because that's the only type of voter fraud that ID laws would catch. Someone who's going to the polling place and pretending to be someone else in order to cast a vote. Voter impersonation fraud is an extremely costly, difficult, cumbersome way to try and rig an election. You need millions of votes to be cast one at a time across all the many states that are needed to capture the Electoral College to win the presidency, for example. That's what's being alleged in 2020. How on earth would you coordinate that massive millions upon millions person effort spread across a number of states? How would you convince a single one of those people to risk a felony conviction in order to cast one single fraudulent vote? That's like asking, if you wanted to rob $3 million from a bank, and I'd pick the number 3 million because that's the number of fraudulent votes that President Trump claimed were cast in the 2016 election. That's like trying to get 3 million people to each go to the bank and rob the bank of $1 for you. Who would do that? Why would you hold up a bank and steal $1? I mean, what's in it for you? And is that really worth the risk you're taking in terms of a felony conviction and all that can go wrong with that kind of crime? Of course not. But we ask for ID in so many situations. What is so unreasonable about asking for ID? We ask for ID in terms of buying alcohol. We ask for people to show their ID if we're not sure they're old enough to go into an R-rated movie. I mean, so what's the big deal? You saw those people in the video that I showed, willingly pulling out their ID. What's the big deal? Well, think about it though. If we didn't have an ID requirement for alcohol purchases, what would happen? Just think about it for a second. What would happen? What would happen is there would be a line outside every liquor store 2 miles long of 12-year-olds trying to sneak in and buy vodka. That's what would happen. There would be a tremendous demand for this product that we don't think 12-year-olds are probably mature enough to handle and ought not to have, so we have requirements for that. Is that the problem we have with voting in this country? That absent some requirements, we're going to have people lined up to do it? Of course not. The problem we have with voting in this country is people not doing it in the first place. Absent requirements, we can only get half the population to bother to do it. So why then, in the absence of any evidence of any actual fraud, why then are we opposing additional requirements to make it more difficult to vote? Remember my law? If you make something more difficult to do, fewer people will do it. And then the other objection I commonly hear is, well, look, if someone wants to vote badly enough, they'll get an ID. That one really rankles me. So someone else gets to impose a litmus test upon another person. You have to want to vote. You have not to just want to vote. You have to want to vote badly enough, as determined, as decided by some other person. It's okay to have some sort of hurdle you have to jump over to be allowed to vote. Please show me in the Constitution where that is. Please show me anywhere in statutory law where there's a certain amount of desire that has to be expressed in order to be allowed to vote. There's not. You have to want to vote more than you don't want to vote. And no one else gets to impose any kind of test upon you that you have to live up to and meet some arbitrary standard set by somebody else to determine how much you want to vote. That's ridiculous. Let's get into the actual motivation behind voter ID laws. And it's about winning elections. It's about power. Normally we think of elections as hinging on voter turnout. And normally we mean mobilizing your side's voters. And election campaigns, and please read the text, it gets into this in some detail. Campaigns spend a lot of time targeting likely voters and turning them out to vote. I worked in elections when I was an undergraduate in 1980, 1984, and 1988. And the thing I did on election day was go knocking on doors trying to get people to get out to vote. So campaigns and elections do spend a lot of time mobilizing their voters. Of course they do. But there's another side of that coin. The other side of that coin is demobilizing the other side's voters. If you think about it, stopping a vote from the other side helps your bottom line towards winning elections every bit as much as generating a vote on your side. And now think for a second about the respective bases of the two political parties in America today. The Republicans' party base is predominantly white, predominantly older, of higher socioeconomic status, predominantly male. The Democratic Party's base is composed more of racial and ethnic minorities, of younger people, of lower income people, and of women. There continue to be long, ongoing demographic shifts in the United States such that the core base of Republican voters is shrinking. And the core base of the Democratic Party's base is growing. That's a problem for the Republican Party in elections if it's simply a numbers game. If everybody turns out to vote, Republicans lose elections because the Democratic base is getting larger and larger. So logically then, a quite reasonable strategy for a party with a shrinking demographic base is to not only maximize their own turnout, but try and minimize the other party's turnout. Squeeze the most they can out of their base and do what they can to lower the turnout among the other side's base. It's not particularly democratic. It's not particularly laudable, but as a strategy, it's certainly effective. And that's the point of voter ID. The point, again, is not to completely disenfranchise the black vote, young people's vote, low-income people's vote. It's not about preventing everyone from voting. It's about shaving a couple percentage points off the aggregate total of a base of people that loyally vote for the Democrats. That's the point. And it's not just voter ID laws. It's voter ID plus trying to roll back the motor voter law. It's trying to end early voting. There's a practice called souls to the polls that took place at black churches, where on Sundays, black congregations after church would pile into buses and go vote. In a number of states, in the aftermath of the Shelby versus Holder decision, Sunday voting was closed so that souls to the polls wouldn't work anymore. It's opposition to same-day registration. It's opposition to extending polling place hours. It's opposition to adding additional polling places, to make these long lines that we've witnessed in many recent national elections to address that problem, to make voting more easy, more convenient, to make it less onerous. Every one of those things that I just talked about is opposed by the Republican Party. And to make the point a little clearer, here's an overlay of states that have unified Republican control, governor and state legislature, and the imposition of voter ID laws. Now, remember that election procedures are left to the states. Under our system of federalism, among the many things that are left to the states to handle is elections. And we talked about that when we talked about federalism. We talked about the ballot design issues that came up in Florida in 2000 because elections are left to the states. In order to enact voter ID laws, you pretty much have to have Republican control of the entirety of the state government, the executive and the legislative branches. And where you see that, and that's up in this top map, that's where you're going to tend to find voter ID laws. It's not a perfect one-to-one correspondence, but it's pretty close. In terms of statistical correlations, it's probably a 0.9. That's pretty strong. Political scientists have known of this and have studied this for a long time. And here's just one abstract from an article from a few years back about why. So this is a pretty comprehensive data collection effort trying to tease out the variables that predict why a state will or will not adopt restrictive voting practices. And once you factor in all the possible reasons why a state could, and you run the data, basically what it comes down to is, let's see, I'll find it in the abstract. Our results indicate that proposal and passage of restrictive voter ID laws are highly partisan, strategic, and racialized affairs. These findings are consistent with a scenario in which the targeted demobilization of minority voters and African Americans is a central driver of recent legislative movements. The whole point is disenfranchising black voters in very much the same sense as the poll tax and the literacy tests were in the late 1800s, which is why this is known as Jim Crow 2.0. It's the same game, the same stuff that we've seen in this country for years, it's just different packaging. This kind of stuff has an effect on our confidence in electoral systems. And one of the articles I'm going to have you read is a look at what happens when conspiracy theorists throw up the specter of voter fraud and rigged elections that justify things like voter ID laws and justify the consideration that I showed in the earlier video that President Trump floated of suspending the Constitution because of alleged claims of massive voter fraud and just reinstoring him into power. That kind of stuff has an effect on our confidence in the efficacy of our political institutions. And that's a pretty important consequence. That's a pretty important thing. You know, if you're a sports fan and your team loses, it's one thing to feel bad about that and wish your team had done better. It's a whole nother thing to have a sneaking suspicion that the only reason your team lost was because the umpires were out to get you. That's the kind of the effect that these voter fraud claims and these election rigging claims and all these conspiracy theories have on our confidence as Americans in our institutions of government and in particular in our electoral institutions. If we come to believe, if sizable portions come to believe that elections are not legitimate processes, that they are rigged and partisan and we can't have any faith in the outcomes, we're in trouble as a democracy. That's not a good place to be in, because if we can't settle our political disputes through the normal means of normal politics, through elections, then we look to other means. And those other means tend to be chaotic, even violent, and not at all pretty. And I hate to end the video segment of this class on that alarming note, but I'm going to.